I want to start by expressing my gratitude to the conference organizers, the chair of this session, and the translators. Judith Koenig, Gertrud Ladner, Sofia Nikitaki, my colleague Jonas Salomonsen, Crystal Meyer, Maria Vidal, and Antonina Wozna. Despite the many blockades met along the way, they managed to shepherd this conference into existence at a moment where the themes that bring us together today have arguably become more important than they've been for a long time. I'm so grateful for their efforts, even and especially as I was very much looking forward to being together with you all in the flesh. And this, at the moment, one-way conversation is, I very much hope, the beginning of a longer-term engagement rather than a singular encounter. The title of my talk today is Gender Matters. That gender matters seems both so obvious that it might not need to be said at all, and so important that many of our most pressing global and local concerns cannot be seriously engaged with unless we examine the multiple, often contradictory ways gender matters. At this moment, as the all too appropriate theme of our conference suggests, confronting gender polarity and nationalism, gender is once more coming to matter in ways deeply opposed to most feminist aims, whether our geographic focus is on my home country of Norway, on Europe and its guarded and contested borders, or on my primary residence in the United States. The short reflection I'm offering today is not what I had thought I would talk about months ago when the abstract for this paper suddenly came due. In February, it was still very dark outside, and we believed that we would be able to be together in person. But it is now August, the end of summer, but still summer, and I'm recording this talk on Panopto, using a technology that has been so helpful during the last several years, and that has also been a medium, for me at least, of estrangement from the world around. The reflection I offer today is a case study grounded in lesbian, queer, feminist, and trans histories of how, even and especially in difficulty and disagreement, we might work towards disagreeing better, understanding each other better, creating better. Because as our sophisticated theoretical insights proliferate, we remain trapped in a time of significant cultural, political, and technological upheavals. These upheavals make our time pressingly urgent, yet we often struggle to be heard and struggle with each other through the noise of old or new wars, sedimented political divisions, and the hardening of gender norms. A deep, stabilized present and some bleak futures seem to be all we can offer. But sometimes, returning to a place of pain might offer resources for working toward a better future. That, at least, is what I want to suggest in this case study. Joan Nestle's edited volume, The Persistent Desire, a Femme Butch Reader, came out in 1992. It became an instant classic, not only because of the distinguished lineup of contributors offering memory, poetry, erotics, theory, but also because butch femme relationships had become places of feminist disagreement during the preceding years. Historically, butch and femme are lesbian and maybe queer genders, but histories of sexuality and gender often run into trouble around questions of naming, since historical and geographical differences in the organization of sexuality and gender make both identification and comparison difficult. Many of us may well be familiar with one way that such difficulty emerges in Christian debates over sexuality and biblical interpretation. Is lying with a man as with a woman the same as, similar to, or utterly different from what we currently know and live as homosexuality? While different interpreters give different answers to such questions, the significance of them is not limited to those who want to give permission for or forbid same-sex relations on biblical grounds, but actually extend to all of us who are interested, whether personally or professionally, in the different ways people organize their gendered and sexed lives. Now, in the 1970s, as feminism's so-called second wave rolled over the United States, butch and femme became heavily contested terms. The conventional wisdom in middle-class, mostly white feminist circles was that butch and femme were outdated ways to organize lesbian relationships. Most simply, butch and femme indicate erotic relations between women whose gender expression is more typically coded as masculine and women whose gender expression is more typically coded as feminine. Let me pause for one moment. The inadequacy of all these terms is a main theme of my discussion today. So I won't pause each time I use a term to say, this term is not great, this definition is not ideal, none of this is fully adequate. If I did, that would be all we ended up doing together today. But please assume that anytime I use one of these contested terms, queer, feminine, gender, lesbian, sexuality, or so on, we have agreed inadequate, inaccurate, what we have available to us. So conventional feminist wisdom in the 1970s was that butch-femme relations tried to imitate heterosexuality because they held on to stereotypical gender codes, even if, as in the case of the butch, the masculine person was a woman. Wanting to free themselves and others from stereotypically gendered expectations, many feminists, especially those from respectable middle-class backgrounds, rejected butch and femme as outdated and heteropatriarchal. Instead, maybe they adopted relatively sort of jeans, t-shirt, makeup-free styles that were taken to avoid exaggeratedly gendered forms of expression. But as always, not all feminists agreed. Some Black, white, or Chicano lesbians from working-class backgrounds, as well as some historians, recognized the real significance of the class differences that affected lesbian social relationships. While upper-class and later middle-class, mostly white women were often able to create extensive lesbian social networks in their homes, which had plenty of room for entertaining, whether those homes were in Paris, Bloomsbury in London, or New York, working-class white, brown, and Black women were more often consigned to meeting other lesbians in bars. Because of licensing laws regarding alcohol after Prohibition in the United States, and because of gender norms that frowned on women meeting in public places to drink, lesbian bars were often considered disreputable by those coming from respectable social backgrounds. Yet, they were also among the only places where same-sex attracted women could find each other. I've encountered many different variations of this story from various countries and various decades. Let's say someone's looking for a way to come into lesbian life. Coming out in this kind of language once meant not coming out of the closet, but coming into the life, that is, homosexuality. So the key was to find a masculine-looking woman, a butch, on the street, and follow her until she went into a lesbian bar where you would find all the lesbians. The other riskier strategy typically was to ask a taxi driver. In a book that appeared around the same time as The Persistent Desire, two scholars looked at the history of working-class lesbian life in a manufacturing town in upstate New York from around the 1930s to the 1960s, the period immediately before second-wave feminism's turn to lesbianism away from butch-femme relationships. In Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, Elizabeth Kennedy and Madeline Davis showed that, as they put it, butch-femme culture was an integral part of the growth of lesbian community, culture, and consciousness because it announced lesbianism to the public and organized lesbian desire. Eventually, though, the persecution of same-sex relations that accompanied the emergence of the Cold War and anti-communist sentiments from the 1950s meant that relatively better-off lesbians retreated into their homes and a silent private life, while working-class lesbians remained in bar culture and mostly blue-collar jobs. Kennedy and Davis's work was enormously influential in the development of the field we sometimes call the history of sexuality. It offered rich historical detail and theoretical sophistication in the way it approached class and racial differences between same-sex attracted women. It implicitly and sometimes explicitly criticized it implicitly and sometimes explicitly criticized the middle-class lesbian rejection of butch femme roles, and it traced historical developments in how same-sex attracted women named and identified themselves, whether as lesbians, as gay women, just as butch or femme, or so on. So in 1992, this edited volume, The Persistent Desire, emerged alongside other work that was reclaiming histories of butch and femme as forms of lesbian gender and desire. Thus, the title of the book, The Persistent Desire. For many who understood their own genders or sexualities through these categories, butch and femme were also ways to insist on the sexuality of lesbianism and on the inventiveness and significance of queer genders that moved beyond this notorious binary of male or female. The Persistent Desire includes contributions from authors who are not necessarily well known today, but it also includes texts from people like Leslie Feinberg, author of the influential Stone Butch Blues, poet Audre Lorde, activist Amber Hollybaugh, the pioneering Chicana feminist Sherry Moraga, Black lesbian feminist poet Cheryl Clark, and the activist Patrick Califia, who co-founded the first lesbian feminist BDSM group in the United States. I first encountered Patrick Califia somewhere around 1998. I had recently discovered feminism, this discourse that finally explained to my 19-year-old self so many of the experiences I'd had that I thought were personal rather than political. I was also in the throes of a short, dramatic, tumultuous, etc. relationship with my second girlfriend, a soft butch who was surprised that I hadn't heard of Patrick Califia, the famous Leatherdyke author of Macho Sluts, a book title that remains iconic in its transgressive perfection. At the time, Patrick was still known as Pat, at least publicly, though his gender was never uncomplicated, as so many genders are not. Let me share with you, as we dig into this case study, a brief selection from one of the 4 poems of his that appear in The Persistent Desire. This poem is called I Love Butches, and while we shouldn't necessarily identify the I of a poem with the I of its author, let's take a moment to pay attention to the complexity of the contours, the shapes of gender and sexuality as they appear here. He writes, I love butches, the muscles, the short hair. Butches need my hands, my mouth, my eyes, because I see, I handle, I bestow the heart on the female phallus. Understand me. My tricks, sexual partners, are butches. Not men, not boys, butches. Even if they seem like boys with female parts to you, I know they are women. I am, after all, a lesbian. I lust after beautiful women, and butches are the most beautiful women in the world. In Patrick Califia's poem, butches with muscles, short hair, and a phallus, a female phallus, which is recognized by the lesbian whose desire is for butches, these butches become the most beautiful women in the world. What's happening in this poem doesn't map easily onto rigid accounts of gender identity, bodily morphology, or sexuality, even as it touches on all of them. That touch is explored further in another essay from the collection that I still assign regularly in my classes. It appears near the end of The Persistent Desire, and it has another one of those classic titles. The essay is by Gail Rubin, who's still best known for authoring 2 of the most significant essays in queer theory before it was queer theory, The Traffic in Women and Thinking Sex. In the history of feminism, Rubin's work is often cited as a turning point because she argued that feminism, as a theory of gender, might not be adequate to the demands of thinking sexuality. We can leave that discussion for another day or for when we are able to be together, hopefully in a couple of years, and return to this somewhat lesser known essay that we find in The Persistent Desire, which is called Of Catamites and Kings, Reflections on Butch, Gender, and Boundaries. Now, this essay was first published 30 years ago and then republished in Deviations, a collection of Rubin's most influential essays, about a decade ago. In queer, lesbian, or trans circles, a decade is maybe more like a century, and 30 years might as well be 3,000. I exaggerate, of course, but it was only a couple years ago that I learned that some of my queer students thought they couldn't have been present at Yale 10 years earlier. This is at the institution that's been known as the Gay Ivy since at least the 70s. Histories are short, memories are short. Of Catamites and Kings takes up what are sometimes called the border wars, the debates in gay, queer, and trans circles over how to name, understand, classify, engage with, and live lives and genders that don't easily map onto conventional boundaries. Throughout the essay, Rubin pays close attention to commonalities and differences, acknowledging exceptions and inadequacies, disagreements about what things mean and what they should mean. And we're now going to spend a while examining some of these claims that Rubin makes. She says, butch and femme are ways of coding identities and behaviors that are both connected to and distinct from standard societal roles for men and women. Among lesbian and bisexual women, as in the general population, there are individuals who strongly identify as masculine or feminine, as well as individuals whose gender preferences are more flexible and fluid, both connected and distinct. Rubin traces a variety of different meanings of masculinity in the way people live their genders, noting that masculinity might, in some cases, signal lesbianism. In others, enacting masculinity might be a way for women to claim power. Or for others, masculinity might just attach to women who find men's clothing better made and more comfortable than women's clothing. But, Rubin continues, butch is also the indigenous or homegrown lesbian category for women who are gender dysphoric, scare quotes in original. Rubin emphasizes that she doesn't mean dysphoric as a clinical or diagnostic category, but as a descriptive term for a whole range of non-standard relationships between one's gender feelings and identities and one's body. Dysphoria may be stronger or weaker, but it's present, Rubin argues, in many variants in lesbian communities. But, she says, while gender dysphoria is often present in lesbian socialities, it's nonetheless underexplored and also a source of anxiety. Rubin traces some of those differences. She says, many butches have partially male gender identities. Others border on being, and some are female-to-male transsexuals, FTMs. Although many lesbians and FTMs find the areas of overlap between butchness and transsexualism disturbing. Saying that many butches identify as masculine to some degree does not mean that all, or even most, butches want to be men, although some undoubtedly do, Rubin says. Most butches enjoy combining expressions of masculinity with a female body. The coexistence of masculine traits with a female anatomy is, she says, a highly charged, eroticized lesbian signal. Rubin goes on to consider what we might call stereotypical visions of butchness, a lesbian James Dean or a lesbian Marlon Brando, but then says, there are many different ways to be masculine. Men get to express masculinity with numerous and diverse cultural codes, and there's no reason to assume that women are limited to a narrower choice of idioms. There are at least as many ways to be butch as there are ways for men to be masculine. Actually, there are more ways to be butch. Because when women appropriate masculine styles, the element of travesty produces new significance and meaning, Rubin argues. She notes that butches vary in how they relate to their female bodies, and that signals of masculinity also vary according to race, culture, nation, class, and other factors. In a delightful example, she says, classical musicians differ from jazz musicians, who are distinguishable from rock and roll musicians. All of these are recognizable male styles. Rubin then traces the different sexual practices that butches and femmes might engage in. Every conceivable combination of butch, femme, intermediate, top, bottom, and switch exists, she says, even though some combinations are rarely acknowledged. Indeed, she points out, sometimes butches partner with other butches and femmes with femmes. I could keep going. I think this essay rewards reading and rereading. But rather than give you infinite quotes throughout an infinite video, let me pick out a few more telling lines and then try to bring together the implications of this case study of the history of the complications of butch and femme genders. Rubin utterly rejects the idea that if we simply worked hard enough, we could come up with the right classifications and categories for the ways humans relate to each other and differ from each other in terms of gender and sexuality. Instead, Rubin walks onto that very contested terrain, the border wars. She points out that butches and trans men are both similar to and different from each other. Sometimes butches transition later on, she says. Sometimes people try on a butch identity and a trans identity in order to figure out which is the right fit for them. Sometimes you might not be able to distinguish a butch from a trans man by any outward sign. These differences are, Rubin insists, confused and overlapping. Not in bad or dangerous ways, but in ways that don't lend themselves to a full mapping or disentangling. Yet, in spite of the overlap and kinship between some areas of lesbian and transsexual experience, many lesbians are antagonistic toward transsexuals, Rubin points out in the language that was common as she was writing. Despite theoretically embracing diversity, she says, contemporary lesbian culture has a deep streak of xenophobia. Rubin notes that we can't control people's emotional responses to each other, but she insists that intense emotions make bad policy. Now, to be clear, it's not that Rubin is imagining we could figure out an emotion-free arrangement of sex-gender relations. I think we all know that's delusional. But she worries, for excellent reasons, that when we experience distaste, alienation, confusion, or threat in relation to sex and gender practices that differ from our own, we often struggle to react well. For example, she points out, again, I'm using Rubin's language from 1992, a cross-dressing, dildo-packing, bodybuilding butch with a male name and masculine pronouns might still have other bodily characteristics that uphold the conflicted, complicated interactions of gendered signs and signals that are typical of the desire for a butch. If that same person then grows a mustache, develops a lower voice, or begins to bald, Rubin says, many lesbians may no longer be attracted to him, even if, as is not unusually the case, his partner or partners are themselves lesbian. So instead of sorting people out through classification, what Rubin calls border patrols, surveillance, and expulsion, she advocates letting people figure out for themselves where their most significant attachments will be. A lesbian doesn't necessarily become not a lesbian because her partner transitions, although, as always, in some cases, others do. People, of course, transition in different ways. using different technologies, as well as differently gendered symbols, identities, and bodily morphologies. Some of us will find these combinations attractive. Some of us will want to or have tried them out for ourselves. Some of us don't and won't. Again, according to Rubin, if community membership were based on universal desirability, no one would qualify. Our desires, she insists, can be as selective, exclusive, and imperious as we like. Our society should be as inclusive, humane, and tolerant as we can make it. In other words, people are different. We won't always like it. People change in their own lifetimes and over time. And no identity or strategy will work for everyone or always. Categories and identities are important and incomplete at the same time. I wish we could take the time to revisit a selection of Rubin's footnotes in this essay as well, where she points out the similarities, differences, and challenges of some of these relationships. Instead, let's skip forward to something very close to the present day before we look at the implications of the case study I've offered. In a short essay from 2019 called Making Lesbian History Possible, the lesbian activist and author Sarah Schulman, whose recent history of ACT UP has been making waves all over the place, notes that lesbian history is very difficult. Difficult to write, difficult to find, difficult to argue for. Identity categories generate complicated responses, she points out. And the term lesbian, in particular, has a complex and sometimes mocking history attached to it. Many who approach the category or who have some relation to it find it both attractive and repellent. For what it's worth, I certainly recognize myself in the mirror Schulman holds up here. An area roughly marked out by queer, dyke, and lesbian is hugely important to my experience of desire in the world. Yet, none of those terms can be fully embraced or rejected in any way that feels truthful to me. And in my particular case, my gender is definitively lesbian rather than trans, hard femme if you're curious, but since it is not trans, I happily hold on to the term cis for political reasons. And so on and so forth. Maybe at our next conference, if we are able to enjoy all the fun that our organizers had intended for our meeting this time, we could explore these questions further across different histories and contexts. But in this short essay, in order to look at the complexity of lesbian history, Sarah Schulman turns to a beautiful but biography of the influential minimalist painter Agnes Martin. Schulman notes that Martin's biographer acknowledges that Martin's most significant relationships were with women. But the biographer moves past that pretty quickly, saying only that Martin herself refused terms like lesbian or feminist. But Schulman responds, whether Martin was a lesbian, a woman, and or a man, does not mean that feelings, desires, longings, refusals, experiences, conversations, silences, actions, and repressions with women are not deeply and fundamentally relevant to her history. And, Schulman continues, the content of those experiences and refusals of experience are more important than the question of Martin's sexual or gender category. In order to understand Martin, Schulman suggests that we temporarily forget about who calls themselves a lesbian, why or why not. Instead, she says, I propose that we look into the emotional, psychological, economic, political, intellectual, artistic, sexual, daily, and lifelong experiences of women who allowed or refused the embrace of a term like lesbian. The conversations that did happen and did not. The words permitted and those uttered without permission. The fears, the imaginations, erotic and projected. The walks in the woods, the fucking, the pleasure of the company, the actions, the artworks, books, tears, orgasms, realized, failed, imagined, remembered. Kisses that were and should have been, and how this moved the earth, the culture, the society, or even just one or two people's small lives. I propose, Schulman says, that we call this whatever we want to call it, but that we not let it fall by the wayside. We don't let it disappear. Show it all, she says, and let the chips fall where they may. Now, the essay is short. It has about 2 pages following the selections we just looked at. So I'm not going to retrace Schulman's steps in those 2 pages, but if you happen to be interested in lesbian gossip, you should retrace those steps and also look at the recently published excerpts from Patricia Highsmith's diary and either of John Giorno's 2 memoirs to start with, lesbian gossip. But Schulman's proposal, we can put it next to Rubin's reflections to suggest a path for approaching sexuality and gender that avoids becoming fully entangled, stuck in the border wars, the terminological conflicts, and the way genuine experiences of alienation, scarcity, and threat may overdetermine our responses to each other in situations where we feel ourselves othered and or othering. In other words, my argument in this talk is that this case study from a particular and limited aspect of lesbian history might nonetheless provide a flexible template for how to engage in gender matters when gender matters. And we are in a time when gender matters. Right-wing and nationalist movements condemn, outlaw, or mock gender and sexuality studies. Neo-Nazis attack gay and queer-friendly bars and clubs. Abortion rights are being renegotiated. Many young cis men are offered few, if any, options for creating lives that they might desire. People who share an attachment to the term feminist vehemently disagree about who feminism is for. And the constant ratcheting up of conflict means that people are constantly being pushed into relatively inflexible positions, sometimes even for excellent reasons. You have to fight the battles that are given to you. But in the midst of all this, people who are classed, sexed, gendered, and racialized in divergent and sometimes conflicting ways are, in their own lives, challenging assumptions around what means what, expanding the boundaries of normativity for the better, and struggling over how best to explore and enact the varied capacities of flesh to signal meaning and elicit desire. As I was writing this talk, I had to check my memory of exactly when Patrick Califia became Patrick. So I looked at his Wikipedia page. Scholar, right? Imagine my surprise to find that he'd given a paper at the American Academy of Religion meeting in 2009. I attended that meeting for the first time in 2008, skipped 2009, missing him, and then attended most years since then. In this one concrete example, we're reminded how often we scholars of religion note the extent to which religions and religious practices are committed to and engaged with various organizations of gendered and sexed being. Those of us working on or around Christianity in particular are often inclined to look for variations, differences, in the hopes of uncovering, rediscovering, or creating a Christianity that is trans-inclusive, queer-friendly, and gender-sensitive. Today, because it's now August and not February, and because we are on line because the funding authorities who have the money pretend that what we're doing here is not particularly important, quite wrongly, I suggest instead that we go further beyond looking for this trans-inclusive, queer-friendly, and gender-sensitive Christianity. Gender matters. Engaging with how gender matters, how sexuality emerges, where they become conflictual, and especially how we remain with the conflicts, requires, our case study suggests, some work from us. We need, I think, to continue developing capacities for imagination, rich engagement and redescription, an interest in being surprised, a staying with conflict rather than avoiding it, and a willingness to risk naming our own experience without insisting that others must necessarily commit to those names in the exact way and degree that they become meaningful for us. I suggest that both Schulman's and Rubin's accounts push towards all of these elements. Because as Rubin's exploration shows, gender matters. But it doesn't matter in the flat way that it sometimes appears to do when we ask, is this normative or non-normative, transgressive or not, binary or non-binary, and so on. Such distinctions are so fundamentally inadequate that the harder we press on them, the less we see. Instead, we need to cultivate capacities for imagination, rich engagement, and redescription, and for being surprised. Imagination, for example, helps us when we encounter something that confuses us. What and who is a macho slut? Why might someone enjoy something I dislike? Or what does it feel like to enjoy that thing? How many butches can dance on the head of a pin? Okay, not that one, but imagination gets us, if we leave it on its own, just into our own heads, though. Imagination needs to be informed by the rich engagement, redescription, life that we see reflected in both Rubin and Schulman's writings. Rubin's capacity to say, some butches are like this, and some are like that, and also some people who are like that aren't butches, and so on, reflects her deep engagement in lesbian, trans, and what I've come to call lesbian-adjacent socialities, people who may date lesbians whether or not they themselves are women. And rather than allowing feelings of scarcity, loss, and threat to cloud her capacity to engage with the differences of butch and trans lives, Rubin acknowledges that such feelings may be present, scarcity, loss, threat, and then offers a model for encounters that neither overwrite nor remain stuck with such feelings of scarcity and loss. And this is not only a model for doing the history of sexuality or engagement with sex and gender differences. It also helps us to return directly to our theme of nationalism, to understand the forces that shape what Katie Olivero calls vulnerability politics. The way that experiences of vulnerability can generate highly undesirable political outcomes, including anti-democratic and right-wing nationalisms that are invested in paper-thin masculinities, and political alliances that see questions of sexuality and gender as trivial at best and, at worst, dangerous. Rubin models engagement with real and possible experiences of loss and threat without succumbing to the ethical pressure such experiences might otherwise be thought to hold. Put more simply, some lesbians may feel loss when a butch transitions, but that feeling of loss does not justify patrolling the border between butch and trans men to include one and exclude the other. The reality of gender and sexuality the realities are divergence and variation. Distinctions like normative or non-normative, woman or not woman, quickly fall flat in encounter with the complex and creative ways that people explore and shape their gendered lives, even within what are often considered heteronormative relational structures. And here's where an interest in being surprised becomes very helpful. We can't decide whether or not we're going to be surprised, but we can look very hard and very carefully for what we might find surprising. Such looking is demanding, though. It can't retreat from encounter with the concrete and specific, even when what we find is alienating or disappointing. And then, necessary as these capacities for imagination, engagement, and surprise might be, they will not lead us to a harmonious sense of who and how we ought to be in the world. Divergence and conflict are ineluctable. Our ethical responsibility is not to define conflict out of existence or to announce very loudly that other approaches to the differences that hurt are by definition intolerable. Our ethical responsibility is to engage. This is not an abandonment of ethics, but it is an ethical call to conflict. This is not the false abstraction of a democratic encounter on a flat plane either. It's a real encounter with neighbors and enemies whose experiences and desires diverge, sometimes devastatingly, from our own. What you like, I hate. What I want, you find threatening or maybe just trivial. Which implies also that we can and must name our own experiences without overriding experiences that differ. In a line I've often quoted from queer theologian Marcella Althaus-Reid, she says that heterosexual women too need to come out, acknowledging how their lives depart from the strictures of compulsory heterosexuality. I sometimes find Althaus-Reid's comment frustrating because it seems to erase the difference between a heterosexual and a queer departure from compulsory heterosexuality. Such feelings are real, but they are not able to ground engagement with the complexities of sex and gender differences. Our task, here as always, is to find ways to root ourselves into the ground of our shared world.